Welcome to this evening's installment of the National Humanities Center Virtual Book Club. I'm Robert Newman, President and Director of the Center, and your host for this evening's event. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for the fifth in our series of virtual book club events. And I want to start this evening, given that it's a beautiful spring in the South, although it's raining here today in North Carolina, with a poem from the Belle of Amherst, Emily Dickinson, about May flowers. Pink, small and punctual, aromatic, low, covert in April, candid in May, dear to the moss, known by the knoll, next to the robin in every human soul. Bold little beauty, bedecked with thee, nature forswears antiquity. Before I introduce this evening's guest, Cara Robertson, I want to point out that while you'll hear only my voice and Cara's tonight, you can participate in the conversation by using the comments section, and I encourage you to pose your questions and to offer your thoughts at any time. I'll be monitoring that part of the conversation and will bring your questions to Cara's attention. I also encourage you to respond to one another. We're being joined by people from across the country, and this is a wonderful opportunity to interact with those who share your interests. Now, let me share a little bit about our guest tonight. Over the last 20 years, Cara Robertson has become the leading expert on one of the most famous and controversial murder trials in American history. But the countless hours she has spent painstakingly researching the case of Lizzie Borden encompasses far more than the question of whether Lizzie actually committed the crimes. Cara has sought, instead, to understand why the Borden case captured the American imagination, and to see not only what it reveals about 19th century American jurisprudence, but the Victorian era norms of class and gender that simultaneously shaped the trial and were troubled by it. Cara is particularly well suited to exploring these questions as she received her BA from Harvard, summa cum laude, in History and Literature and Women's Studies, before going to Oxford, where she received her doctorate in English Language and Literature. After Oxford, she studied law at Stanford and went on to serve as a clerk for two U.S. Supreme Court Justices, Byron White and John Paul Stevens, before working as a legal advisor to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, where she was involved in the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic and others for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Since that time, Cara has increasingly focused her attention on scholarly pursuits, for which she has been recognized with fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Humanities Center. And while working on this book and her other scholarly projects, Cara has found time to serve as a trustee of the National Humanities Center, and we are grateful immensely for that. Please join me in welcoming Cara Robertson.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. The National Humanities Center is where this book project really launched in earnest, and so it seems especially fitting to bring it all full circle here. I'm also, immensely proud of the institution, and I'm glad to participate in anything involved in it. Um, what I thought I would do tonight is to talk about the case in three parts. The first part being, what drew me to the case. Why do I think it's worth talking about? Why on earth did I spend so long on it? The second part will be just a short discussion of some of the interesting points. Many of you will know a lot about the story, but there might be some of you who don't know all the details. And then thirdly, I'll circle back in answering the question, did she or didn't she, to that first part, which is, why should we actually care about this? over 100 years later. So first to why, I think it's America's unsolved mystery. It's certainly still a why done it, even if you are fairly convinced that you know who done it. It's reminiscent of those Golden Age detective novels in which all the suspects are gathered in some particular home, and once you rule out the possibility of a Mr. X sneaking in and committing the crimes, really you're left with the people in the house, and the idea is to figure out exactly where everyone was at any particular moment. They're often called locked room mysteries, these kind of impossible crimes that require someone like Poirot to solve. And there is an element of that in this story, which is something that I'll talk about when I get to the details of the case. But more than that, it has an almost mythic quality. I think that if you distill the case to its essence, it's the story of an extremely unhappy family in one house, and it's a story of festering tensions and secrets. And I think that gives it, if not a mythic quality, certainly almost like a fairy tale quality, and that continues to draw people regardless of time and place. I should say that for myself, those things were hooks, but I was interested in the specificity of the story. That if you return the case to its time and place, it provides a wonderful lens onto that era. That we can see through the details of the case a lot of the assumptions and anxieties in the Gilded Age or the late Victorian age in America. And we can see a society that mirrors our own in certain ways that we might find uncomfortable. And so I thought it was worth pursuing for that reason as well. As for the case itself, it begins on August 4th, 1892, when an elderly couple, Andrew Borden and his second wife, Abby, are found hacked to death in their Fall River, Massachusetts home. Fall River, as many of you will know, was a mill town. It was called the Manchester of America. And it was a town of a fair amount of hierarchy, gradations of social status, where immigrant labor provided the engine for the mills, but the Yankee elite mostly owned them. And it is also a town where the peculiar topography mirrors the social hierarchy. So that, to put it a little crudely, the higher you live, the higher your status. And the Bordens, this couple that were found murdered, lived in a small house near this commercial city center. What was essentially a solidly middle-class district. So it was shocking to find people killed in that way, and particularly in a place that was otherwise fairly quiet, but still close enough to the center of town that it was hardly like it was an isolated farmhouse. The murders were so violent that some people speculated that Jack the Ripper himself had come to America. The details were pretty gruesome. First, Abby was felled by 19 blows in an upstairs guest room. And then about an hour and a half later, after returning from a morning walk around town to attend to business, Andrew received 10 blows as he lay sleeping on the sitting room sofa. His face resembled raw meat, yet, according to one of the first people on the scene, the house itself was an apple pie order. And it is striking for those of us who are used to Law and Order or CSI, how many people just were wandering in and out of the crime scene on that particular day. But most importantly, it just seemed to be the work of a madman. And the murders themselves would have generated um, front page news, even had there not been this odd development. And the odd development was that there were two key things that seemed to rule out the murderous stranger that people expected to find. The first reason that seemed unlikely was that the house was locked, both front and back, and the only access was through a side door. Now, it's an open question whether or not it had actually been latched during the morning, but it was known that it was often within view of either a neighbor or the Irish domestic housemaid, whose name was Bridget Sullivan. So it seemed unlikely that someone would have been able to get in that way unseen, though it was theoretically possible. But the second fact made that even more unlikely, and that was the interval between the murders. Mrs. Borden was killed about 9:30 in the morning, and Mr. Borden was killed an hour to an hour and a half later. And so that meant that whoever had gotten in, if indeed someone had, then that person would have had to hide inside the house and wait for Mr. Borden to come home. Now, it raised the question of why anyone would want to kill Mrs. Borden at all, because she was not someone who seemed to have any enemies. Mr. Borden seemed a possible target in that he was on the extreme end of Yankee frugality, let's say. He was known to be a bit of a miser and a hard man in his business dealings. That's how he was described. So, in theory, it was possible that there was a dispute, though, again, it seemed unlikely. But with regard to the person hiding, um, it was made even less likely by uh, the layout of the house. The house had been a two-family tenement with an upstairs and a downstairs layout um, made for individual families. And that meant that there were no halls in the house, that the rooms opened onto each other. So to get from one side of the house to the other, um, you had to walk through actual rooms as opposed to the hallway. And in theory, there was a closet upstairs in which someone could have hid, but it's coupled together with the amount of time the person would have had to hide and the difficulty of securing access to the house in the first place, it just seemed very unlikely. And that meant that instead of looking for an insane madman, the police turned their attention to the people inside the house. And aside from the Bordens, Andrew and Abby, who had been killed, there were three people known to be in the house that morning. The first was a man named John Morse, who was Andrew Borden's brother-in-law. He was known to have left before Mrs. Borden died to go visit friends across town. And in one of the many peculiar features of the case, he had an alibi that was straight out of an Agatha Christie novel. He remembered the number of the conductor's cap and other details that seemed to clear him. And lest you run away with that one. The conductor, it is true, didn't remember him specifically, but he did remember the 6 priests that Morse named as his fellow travelers on that particular horse car. So we can rule him out for the moment. That left 2 women who were in the house on the morning of the murders. One of them was Bridget Sullivan, whom I mentioned was the housemaid. She was known to be washing windows at the time that Mrs. Borden was killed. She had been spotted by a neighboring housemaid. And if we're assuming that both people were killed by the same person, then that seems to eliminate her. And so that left the Borden's younger daughter, Lizzie Borden. Joel, can you put up the picture, please? Thank you. So that is Lizzie Borden. At the time of the murder, she was 32 years old. She did have an older sister who also lived at the house. Both were unmarried, but the older sister was away visiting friends at the time of the murder, so she was also not in the house. Okay, Joel, you can drop that out. Thanks. Uh, so as you can see from the picture, she seemed a pretty unlikely axe or hatchet murderer. She's just not at all what people would expect. Um, but there were a couple of suspicious things. The first was that she really couldn't account for her time in any meaningful way. She said she was upstairs. She said she was downstairs. She claimed not to have heard anything. Um, so immediately the police were a little bit suspicious. But what really swung their interest in her direction was learning that she had allegedly tried to buy prussic acid the day before the murder. There were 3 men in a pharmacy who swore that she was the woman who had asked for it. And although she had not received it, it's a deadly drug that is only sold upon doctors' prescriptions. It was thought that that might explain why someone like Lizzie Borden would turn to a household implement rather than poison, which was seen as a woman's weapon. The other main issue was that further investigation disclosed that it was a pretty unhappy house. Essentially that although it looked fairly normal from the outside, that actually it was the site of a sustained Cold War between the generations. Lizzie and her older sister apparently resented their stepmother. Lizzie, in particular, was quite forthright about it and openly disdainful. And this either was caused or brought to the surface by a property dispute about 5 years before the murders. Mr. Borden had attempted to heal the breach by giving his daughter's property that was roughly equivalent to the property he'd given his wife, but it didn't work. And within that small house, the daughters conducted their lives as separately as they could, often receiving visitors in the upstairs guest room, the guest room that had been that later was the site of Mrs. Borden's murder. And as you know, some indication of the ill will in the house after the bodies were discovered, Lizzie corrected the police officer who interviewed her, saying that Abby was not her mother when he assumed that she was. So the circumstantial evidence doesn't look good for Lizzie Borden, particularly when you add the fact that although she had no blood visible at all on her person, it was known that she burned a dress on the Sunday after the murders, a dress that she said had been stained with paint. So all of these things, together suggest a good reason for the police to move in her direction. The prosecution essentially would argue that she was the only one with motive and opportunity to commit the murders. And that, if you recall the image of Lizzie Borden, this was the thing that propelled the case into the national consciousness more than the pointless murder, which might have been a passing headline. Lizzie Borden's trial was something equivalent for those of us who are old enough to remember the O.J. Simpson trial. It was held in New Bedford, which is about 15 miles away from Fall River, and it became the center of press activity in a way that had not been seen before. The case comes to trial during the heyday of yellow journalism, and the telegram is not that old, or telegraph wires rather. And these were deployed so that people at home could follow it with the immediacy of something like, cable news or Twitter updates. And it became quite a sensation for that reason. On the one hand, the prosecution had this strong case, but the defense was not idle. Lizzie Borden hired, again, to gesture towards O.J. Simpson, a dream team of lawyers, one of whom was the former governor of Massachusetts. And they attacked the circumstantial case. They questioned whether or not a woman really could have committed such brutal murders. It should be said that the scientific testimony was that with sufficient leverage, a woman could have inflicted those particular blows. But it was thought that a hatchet or an axe was not a woman's weapon. That these seemed to be male murders, and in this respect, the class as well as the gender was central. This is a woman who ticks all the boxes of respectable upper middle class womanhood. She was a Sunday school teacher. She was active in other ways in her church and local charities. And she presents in the way that you would expect. She takes careful care to look good in court. She dresses well. One journalist describes her hat alone as a model for theater goers. And that interest in the way that she looks and trying to make sense of her and to read her effectively as if she were going to disclose her secrets in that way, gave a lot of fodder for the journalists covering the case. In her favor also were a number of suspicious characters who were seen wandering around the area. And the defense was very clear to say that simply because we don't have an exact other explanation, that doesn't mean that Lizzie Borden necessarily was guilty. The defense also pointed out that no murder weapon was definitively found. The suspicion was that there was a particular hatchet that's now in the Fall River Historical Society, for those who'd like to take a look, that was about 2.5 inches wide, and the blade, and it could well have made all the wounds, but the wounds were of different size, and they never definitively proved that it was that particular weapon. They were also able to point, again, in shades of O.J. Simpson's trial, to questions about how that weapon was discovered to suggest that there was some kind of orchestrated police conspiracy, that these men in power were bumbling around trying to find the killer, and under intense pressure, they just fastened their suspicions upon the daughter, and because she was a convenient target. But their greatest success was really in excluding the pieces of evidence that were most compelling. The first being this alleged attempt to buy prussic acid before the murders, because that would have given the prosecution evidence of intent and punctured the defense contention that Lizzie Borden was simply an innocent bystander who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and would have explained how a well-bred young woman might have turned to a readily available household implement to execute a plan that she had concocted earlier. And they also were able to exclude her inquest testimony. She had been given morphine before the testimony, and it is possible that made her a little loopy. It was known that she contradicted herself time and time again, and that provided, uh, evidence of what we would call consciousness of guilt. Someone who's saying something that can't be true, because they know that saying the truth would put them in a bad place. Her story, incidentally, was that at the time of her father's murder, she was out in the barn eating pears and looking for a sinker. And the police found that just flatly incredible. Um, but the defense is able to turn that sort of thing into an argument in favor of Lizzie Borden's normality, that she's essentially very much like any other woman in her position. Days are much the same. Um, how can you really know exactly what time you started your ironing or went out to look for a sinker? And why wouldn't you stop and eat a pear if you feel like it? You don't have a life of business to take you out in the world. And it was, in fact, a sign of her adherence to proper femininity that she was someone who couldn't really account for her time, that she was someone who was just at home. So it was a hard fought case, but the prosecution, lost its best evidence. The This is the non-spoiler, or the spoiler alert time rather. The jury retreated to consider its verdict, and they found they were unanimous on the first ballot, but decided that they'd better wait an hour and a half so that they would look like they had been fairly deliberative. When they returned, which was still much faster than expected, the judges had to be recalled from a walk. Lizzie Borden was acquitted, and this leads the courtroom to erupt in cheers, followed by cheers outside that apparently could be heard as much as a mile away. And Lizzie Borden returned to Fall River. There, however, the verdict was a little bit more mixed. One journalist said that it reflected the class line as well, much in the way that her arrest was viewed as, if anything, a bit tardy by many of the Irish Catholics and other people who resented the Protestant elite in Fall River. The organs of the Fall River immigrant community generally viewed her as someone who'd just gotten away with murder. Interestingly, they had viewed her self-possession at trial in exactly the opposite way as her defenders. They referred to her as the Sphinx of coolness, and thought that it indicated that self-possession, some kind of unnatural, almost masculine nerve, versus the sign of ladylike bearing or inborn dignity that proved her innocence to her defenders. So the verdict seemed to be split, and Lizzie Borden thought she could, resume her own life. She went to church, and there she was greeted by empty pews all around her. This sent the message pretty clearly, though it was a bit of a shock because the church had provided the bedrock of her support during the trial. There's almost a tribal or anthropological quality to the punishment that's exacted by her, roughly speaking, her social peers, or at least the people that she wanted to be her social peers. She's increasingly shunned. She and her older sister, however, moved from the cramped family house that had been a source of some dissatisfaction to the equivalent of a mansion in the elite Hill district. The location of the Borden house was thought to be one of the sources of dissatisfaction. that Lizzie and her sister thought that they should live in a slightly grander style. And that's something that they achieved with their inheritance. But even then, despite her sister's stalwart support during the trial, about 12 years later, they had a disagreement. It remains a bit mysterious. It may have been about an actress or an acting troupe that Lizzie Borden was a little too friendly with. It may well have been about a handsome chauffeur who had a bad reputation. But in any event, Emma moved out, and the sisters never spoke again. They died within about a month of each other in 1927. And I think that one of the parts of the story that interests me the most is that ending. That Lizzie Borden, who could have gone anywhere, decided instead to return to Fall River and live the life that had been denied her earlier, even in the face of the social disapproval. That rather than take her inheritance and be somewhere where she could be at least um, not notorious, if not entirely private, she chose to remain there. And I think it shows the nerve that people noticed during the trial, that that kind of self possession that seems so troubling to her contemporaries. That's the overview of the story. There are many, as I said, there are many more details which I'm happy to discuss if anyone's interested in it. But it does bring me to the question of did she or didn't she, which is again a non-spoiler alert. This is a question I don't answer in the book because I thought it was important to be as even-handed as possible. There's a way in which I think if you decide one way or the other, it's impossible to be a fair chronicler of what actually happens because the story isn't neat. As I've indicated, albeit in a very abbreviated way, there's evidence that points in both directions. But I think at its heart, it's very troubling to think that someone like Lizzie Borden could have committed these crimes, not perhaps for the reasons that her contemporaries thought it was impossible. For example, not because of her gender or her class, but because we know. And Joel, could you skip ahead to the third picture? So this is what Lizzie Borden looked like in her old age. She's a harmless-looking old lady on her piazza. That's what they call the back porch in Fall River, with her beloved dog, Laddie. And so part of the reason I think this remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history is that we know a bit about Lizzie Borden's life before the murders, and we know about Lizzie Borden's life after the murders. The murders happen roughly in the middle. And she was a pretty unremarkable person. There's evidence that she had a particularly strong nerve, and we know that there was this discord in the household. But it is hard to look at those kinds of pictures and to say, yes, this is someone who would have, as a result of some dispute like that, resorted to the kind of carnage that we see in the crime scene photos, and which I spared you tonight. But I would say that insofar as we want to answer the question, that I'm sort of in the same position as I was when I started, which is that it's very hard to believe, for reasons that I alluded to, that someone was able to sneak in, commit these murders, and leave without being seen. But at the same time, it's also hard to imagine that Lizzie Borden would have been able to do it. The timetable is very tight. So I'm comfortable leaving it as a mystery, and I don't mind that it's unresolved. I think that it's an uncomfortable story, even if we know what the solution is, because there is no obvious explanation for why that could possibly be satisfactory. I think, however, for the jurors, it was less a question of reasonable doubt than an absolute certainty that someone like Lizzie Borden could have committed the murders. And I think I should probably leave it there, and then I'm happy to respond to any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Cara. And we have several questions from our listeners and viewers. So first question, questioner asks, who was the beneficiary of Andrew Borden's estate?
Lizzie and Emma. And that's a question that in some respects goes to the motive, and it would explain the order of deaths. I mean, if you assume a financial motive, which no one at the time was really willing to do because the alleged murderer was a woman and it was considered not really a feminine motive, because Mr. Borden died without leaving a will. The fact that Abby was killed first meant that she didn't inherit anything from him. So the daughters received his entire estate.
Two other questioners are asking about connections with other famous murder cases. One asks about the John Benet Ramsey case and asks if that's an example of a locked room mystery.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit similar, right? That it seems very hard for someone to have come in from the outside, but and I actually don't know what the solution was. I think at one time it was thought that actually there was the stranger, but there was suspicion that suspicion turned to members of the family, as I recall, and part of the difficulty is imagining that a parent would, if that was who it was, would do such a thing. But I should say I'm not as knowledgeable about that I'm sorry, I'm not knowledgeable enough to answer that question.
Well, there's also a question about the Papin sisters of France and if they might have heard about Lizzie Borden.
Yeah, that I don't know, but that's an interesting idea. One of the there are some people who think that Lizzie and Bridget were in it together, which would help explain both the time, the timing, how it's possible for all of it to be for all of the murders to be committed and for the crime scenes to be so clean, other than the bodies. But there's really no contemporary evidence of that. I think had Bridget been a likely suspect, given that the police's first instinct was to look around for immigrants who might be up to no good, that she would have been in big trouble.
Another questioner asks about how unusual might it have been to have a woman of Lizzie Borden's class stand trial for a murder in the 1890s.
Yeah, I think that's the key. There are other women who are who commit or who are accused of murders, but they're not like Lizzie Borden, and they're also usually not charged with committing those kinds of murders. The most famous case in Massachusetts that's roughly contemporaneous, that was a few years earlier, is a woman named Sarah Jane Robinson, who isn't of Lizzie Borden's class. And she was known as the Borgia of Somerville because she used poison, and her relatives, her heavily insured relatives, died with this suspicious regularity. And so that the money motive was unusual and suggested that she was somehow particularly monstrous. But the poison was something that made it comprehensible. And so the combination of the class and the weapon, the fact that this is a very male-coded crime, um, it just puts it in a totally different category.
So was it anomalous to have such prominent attention to gender in legal argumentation at that time? And the questioner also asked about the lack of attention during the trial to Lizzie's being unmarried.
hmm Well, it was. I mean, she's clearly a spinster, or rather, I mean, that was what they called her. And unlikely to be married, though it should be noted that Abby's stepmother was older than Lizzie was at the time of the murders when she married Andrew. So it wasn't impossible for someone to be married, but it was pretty unlikely that she would. But it was considered, as somebody who was active in good works, it was a respectable position to have, and she had a number of friends who were, in some cases, married, but were often unmarried. They were school teachers. They did sort of similar. They spent their days kind of in similar ways, and living at home with her father was a perfectly respectable thing for her to do, and not considered, especially unusual, even if it wasn't the norm.
Another questioner asked about the most challenging aspect for you of researching Lizzie Borden, and did the fame of Lizzie Borden's trial make it difficult for you to separate myth from fact?
Yeah, I think that the key with all these projects is to kind of peel away the layers of the myth. And it was clear that a lot of things that people believed about the case or that were handed down through secondary literature weren't really supported by the primary sources. So going back to the trial transcript and the contemporary newspapers and other local records made it possible to rebuild the record, from the ground up, as it were, and to look at it from the perspective of her contemporaries. One of the one of the things that's most striking, I think, when you're dealing with a famous case like that, is the way in which the interpretations change over the generations, and that they seem to reflect the preoccupations of the era in which those interpretations are written. It's sort of in the same way that Lizzie herself could be read in opposing ways, that the case itself is a bit of a cultural Rorschach test, um, and that I wanted to guard against making assumptions that had more to do with my own opinions or the time I'm living in versus what was actually happening in 1892 and 1893.
How about the class composition of the jury itself?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We think of jury consultants as being a modern a modern invention, but the both the prosecution and the defense investigated the prospective jurors, and I have the notes from the police investigations, and they were clearly looking for solid types. Most of them were not particularly wealthy. There was one real estate owner, is how he's described uh, in the newspapers, uh, who ends up as the foreman. But most of them were sort of a little bit below Andrew Borden in status, and so I think the thought was that that they would aspire and to be someone like him, that they would view him as a success and thus be very unlikely to think that their own daughter would be so ungrateful as to want to as to object to the way that they ran their households. The defense strategy throughout is to make make Lizzie Borden seem as much like one of the jurors' wives or daughters, because then that makes it inconceivable that she would have killed her father. Uh, Interestingly to me, pretty much everyone seems to think that they could understand why Lizzie Borden would want to kill her stepmother, because I suppose because of the fairy tale trope, that there is this idea that she must have been a wicked stepmother in some way. I should say the contemporary evidence does not bear that out. She's a sad figure. Um,
So another questioner asks about your personal stories behind the final chapter about the locked file cabinet. Is there more to tell? Did you make efforts to gain access? And do you have your own suspicions about what might be in that locked file cabinet?
oh well, thank you for the question. So the questioner is referring to the fact that the law firm that was founded by the former governor of Massachusetts is still in operation in Springfield, Massachusetts. And it's just sort of by happenstance, it is continued. Whereas the other lawyers were solo practitioners and their files just kind of went home with them. But because it's continued in operation and the former governor, whose name is Robinson, died unexpectedly a few years after the trial, his files on Lizzie Borden still remain in possession of the law firm. And their position is that they're still bound by this continuing duty of confidentiality, and so they believe that not only can they not disclose the files, they can't even really describe them. Though I do know that they have been preserved, and nothing else from that era, seems to have received that kind of attention. And I asked the managing partner, um, why save it if your position is that you can't disclose it? And he said, well, it would be abhorrent. That was the word he used to destroy it, because it is of historical value. So we're in this. It presents this conundrum, so that for example, I have seen the papers from the prosecution. I've seen the papers about Lizzie Borden's other main defense lawyer, who was her local lawyer. He intriguingly deposited his Lizzie Borden files in a hip bath um, in his attic, and they eventually made their way through a complicated series of descents into the Fall River Historical Society. And they're very useful in terms of trying to get a sense of what the defense strategy was, and also did they interview the witnesses and what was their take on the witnesses. And so my expectation is that if we ever find the Robinson files, that they will reveal something quite similar. But it's very tantalizing to think about one last unsolved mystery associated with the case.
Could you say some more, or could you say something about the response of immigrant communities at the time to the case, and were these responses at all shaped by attitudes toward Bridget O'Sullivan, the domestic servant?
Yeah. So one of the ways that well, I guess there are two main ways I think of to get that information. I mean, one was, as I referred to the Irish Catholic paper in the town, the different ethnicities had different newspapers, and you see that the way that they present the story is very diverges often over the character of Bridget Sullivan versus Lizzie Borden. And the other way is through the letters sent to the police and to the prosecution, which offer a lot of helpful advice, like, do the Bordens have an upright piano, and have you looked at it? That kind of thing. But they also contain a lot of evidence of hostility to immigrants, assumption that it must be Bridget and she must be operating under instructions from the Pope. Other other kinds of conspiracy theories like that. And then opposing that are people, presumably from those communities, who object to the way that the police seem to be uh, treating Lizzie Borden much more tenderly than if she were a mill hand. Um, so a case like this, with all of the clamor on the different sides, gives you a nice window into those kinds of attitudes. Um, it should be said that someone like Bridget Sullivan would have been thought capable of using a hatchet or an axe, because it was often within the duties of a housekeeper to kill animals, or to chop wood. She didn't actually have to do that at the Borden house, but that wouldn't have seemed quite as far-fetched.
Another questioner asked you to elaborate a bit more on Lizzie's sphinx-like, stone-faced aspect during the trial.
Uh, yeah, she just doesn't quite behave in the way that she seems to be expected to behave. So she doesn't break down. She seems, I would say, the things that were most disturbing to me was when it seemed like she was just sort of enjoying it, enjoying the attention, or, uh, I mean, but she also clearly uh, behaves in ways that are, designed to show that she is in fact a proper lady. She hides her face beneath her fan, at when gruesome testimony is offered. One of the reporters notices that her reaction to that kind of gruesome testimony, or really awful exhibits like the skulls of Andrew and Abby that are presented at trial, vary depending upon who's presenting the evidence. So that when it comes from the prosecution, she hides her face in her fan. But when it comes from the defense, she follows it with a lot more interest. But the journalist steps back from the implications of that, and doesn't suggest that she's feigning in a way that suggests guilt. What he says is that she's feigning in a way that suggests femininity. That women are basically like that. They play this. They have to play these artificial roles, and so that's actually a sign in her favor in his view, which just shows you that I think that most people had decided one way or the other, and then use the behavior to bolster their opinion, as opposed to finding something uh, really important from an evidentiary perspective in her demeanor.
Did the jury talk to the press after the verdict?
A few did, yes, and they just sort of rejected that it was impossible. That they didn't view it as a particularly close case. I mean, as indicated by the fact that, despite the fact that it had been a 2.5 week trial, which was unusually long for that time, um, that they came to a conclusion so readily. They had been they were sequestered during the trial, and one of the features of that was that they weren't allowed to drink anything. So they went very quickly to the hotel bar to have a drink together, and had a reunion, or had regular reunions, until they started dying off, which indicated, as one said, that they were a jolly bunch. They also took a picture together to memorialize the trial and sent it to Lizzie Borden, and she wrote letters to each one of them, thanking them for being her deliverers, as she put it.
Can you talk a bit about film or TV adaptations or depictions of the trial? Have there been, and are they any
Yeah,
good?
it's a case that provides a lot of fodder for people who are, well, pretty much any genre you can possibly imagine. ballet, opera, play, as well as TV and film. Um, there's a I suppose I recommend there's an Elizabeth Montgomery TV movie from the 70s that's fairly earnest. It's a little creepy, but it hews fairly close to the story. It's a little bit outlandish about Lizzie Borden's motivations, but it features a kind of blank heroine, which I think it may or may not be totally accurate, but it at least allows the viewer to kind of weigh the evidence rather than revealing some essential characteristic that would have made her definitely a killer or not. The most recent movie is called Lizzie, and it features a relationship between Bridget and Lizzie, and it's definitely the film for the Me Too era because it really piles on um, Lizzie's motivations, to make it a kind of comprehensible crime that Mr. Borden is really bad, uh, and her uncle is trying to get her committed. Plus, she has epilepsy. I mean, they're just a variety of things that put her in an impossible position, so that their plot is sort of a blow against um, patriarchy in general. And I think that's a good example of something that really is more about the moment in which it's made than any kind of essential truth about the mystery or how um, Lizzie Borden herself and her contemporaries would have seen this crime.
Well, thank you so much, Cara Robertson, for a wonderful presentation and conversation. Thank you for answering so many questions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in to our virtual book club from the National Humanities Center. Please join us again next Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, May 27th, when Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf will be presenting their book, Most Blessed of Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of Imagination. If you'd like to learn more about the mission of the National Humanities Center and our programs, please go to nationalhumanities.center.org. I'm Robert Newman. Thank you again for joining us. Be safe and be well. Thank you. Good night.